So we're going to move on to Mike Lauer, who's going to talk about the novel data sources for use in interventional studies.
Oh, I've hijacked your microphone. I'm sorry.
He's the director of the Division of Cardiovascular Sciences at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and the National Institutes of Health.
Okay, good morning. How many of you either had one of these or knew somebody who had one of these? How many of you have one of these now? Actually, I have one too. I went to a store down the street here. This is many years ago. I wanted to get one of these as a prop for a talk. And actually, not many years ago. It was maybe about a couple years ago. And I walked into this photo store and I said, "You remember those Kodak Instamatics?" And they said yes. And I said, do you have one? Can I buy one? And he looked at me like I came from outer space. And then I asked him, well, how could I buy one? And he explained to me, it's very simple. You go to eBay. So I went to eBay and I got a brand new Kodak Instamatic camera. Anyway, in 1976, Kodak ruled the world. They sold 90% of the world's film and 85% of the world's cameras. But at the same time that everything seemed to be absolutely golden for them, they had an engineer whose name was Steve Sasson. And he designed a camera which could take pictures without using film. And that's what the camera looked like. It was big and clunky and difficult to use. And he presented it to management. And they said, well, it's filmless photography. So while it's cute, make sure nobody finds out about it. Now they understood that if this technology, which at that time didn't really look like very much, but if this technology was going to go anywhere, this would destroy their business model. The whole business model was that photography and photographic imaging is based on film. And they figured that they really didn't have too much to worry about because the technology was obviously inferior. So there's a picture on the left that was taken with film. The picture on the right was taken with one of the original digital cameras. Steve Sasson invented the digital camera. The digital camera was invented by Kodak. And you can see the picture. You need this gigantic monitor in order to be able to see the picture, and the picture is blurry. And so you could imagine the executives at Kodak going to their big customers, like, for example, photojournalists or professional photographers, and saying, what do you think about this? And they would say, forget it. It's going nowhere. We have no need for it. And therefore, Kodak would decide not to bother. Well, we know what happened. In 2012, Kodak failed. Kodak went bankrupt. I know they've now sort of come back up from the ashes again. And this is an article from Forbes that said there are few corporate blunders as staggering as Kodak's missed opportunity in digital photography, a technology that it invented. This strategic failure was the direct cause of Kodak's long decline as digital photography destroyed its film-based business model. Now, actually, it isn't all that staggering. We've seen this kind of thing happen over and over and over again, in which a technology becomes entrenched. There is a mainstream industry and a mainstream set of consumers that use that technology. And then from seemingly out of nowhere comes something else, some other new technology that once it eventually gets to a point where it can really work, just blows it out of the water. And one example that we can think about today is the way in which we collect data for clinical trials. And one of my worries is that the research enterprise, the clinical research enterprise as it currently exists, and that includes us at the National Institutes of Health, is Kodak. And that we are living in a world that's kind of like film. And eventually, if we're not careful, we're going to get blown away by a different way of doing things. Okay, so this is referred to as something called disruptive innovation. You may have heard of this. How many of you have read this book, The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen? A few of you have. If you haven't read it, you should. It is an incredible book. I bought this as kind of on a lark. I was at a bookstore and saw it on the shelf, and it kind of looked interesting, so I figured I'd give it a try. And I couldn't put it down. So Clayton Christensen's he talks about computer disks and hydraulic lifts, But we've seen this on many occasions. We've seen it with laptop computers. There was the head of a computer company who once said that he saw no reason why anybody would ever want to have a computer in their own home, and that the world's computer market would maybe be about 5. And the same thing goes with Kodak. How do we take our pictures today? I mean, I was watching some of you take pictures. You take pictures with your telephone. I mean, if you think about it. So these are, he describes this as a process by which a product or a service takes root initially in simple applications at the bottom of a market, and then relentlessly moves up market, eventually displacing established competitors. All right, so what's disrupting us now? These are 2 books by my former boss, Eric Topol. I used to work at the Cleveland Clinic. The Creative Destruction of Medicine, and there he talks about how the digital revolution is upending medical care. And on the right is a book that just came out a few months ago called The Patient Will See You Now. Now Eric goes so far as to say that the smartphone is like the printing press. Now, we'll see. But the smartphone is pretty amazing. And he suggests that the smartphone may change the way medical care is delivered and may very well also change the way research is being conducted. And so this now brings us to the idea that when we conduct clinical trials or clinical studies, the data that we collect may also come from disruptive sources. The traditional source by which we collect data in clinical trials is we create an empire. We create an enterprise of people and tools and technology that goes out and collects the data. And the data are typically collected for the purpose of the trial. Some people have referred to this as a parallel universe. You've got clinical care over here. You've got clinical research over here. They don't really talk to each other very much. The clinical folks are collecting their data. The research folks are collecting their data. And they're 2 entirely separate empires. Now, one of the problems is, let's say from our point of view, we buy clinical trials. If you think about it, that's what we do as a funding agency. These folks over here who have set up their whole empire for collecting research data, they've become awfully expensive. In fact, they've become so expensive that, quite frankly, we can't afford it anymore. And so this is a nice piece that was written by Bob Harrington, who's the chief of medicine at Stanford. He's a cardiologist and a clinical trialist. And Elliot Antman is a cardiologist at the Brigham. And they write here that as trials became popular, the original simplicity was lost, leading to complex trials. And the unintended consequence is to threaten the very existence of randomized trials because of the operational complexities and ensuring costs. An ideal opportunity would be to embed randomization into the electronic medical record or induce randomization into registries. So here we're talking about getting data for clinical trials from rather unorthodox sources. One would be the electronic health record, and the other might be registries that societies like the American College of Cardiology collect. And this is not a fantasy. This is something that's already happening. This is a trial that was conducted in Scandinavia. It was a trial of what's called thrombus aspiration, where you suck the clot out of an artery in a patient who's having a heart attack. And the question was whether or not this procedure led to a better outcome. So what these folks did was they took about 10,000 patients who were being seen in hospitals there, and they randomized nearly 7,000 of them. And all the data that they used for this trial came from registries that were already in existence. These hospitals were part of a registry. The registry collected very high quality data on these patients anyway. They also had various national registries to follow people over time, see whether or not they were hospitalized, see whether or not they died. And in this way, they were able to conduct this trial of about 7,000 patients for $300,000, which is a cost of $50 per patient. Now, to sort of put this in perspective, we recently funded a trial called Accord, which was a diabetes trial that involved 10,000 patients, and that trial cost $300 million. It was a good trial. It was not worth that much. Here's a really good trial for $50 a patient, $300,000. I mean, it's like absolutely dirt cheap. Think about how many of these kinds of trials we could have done for $300 million. Here's a trial that's being done in Canada. There's an interesting controversy right now about whether or not if you take blood from a donor and you put it on the shelf and you leave it on the shelf for a longer period of time, that may lead to a worse clinical outcome than if you give blood that is fresh. And so what they're doing is they're taking 24,000 patients and they're randomizing them to get older units of blood, that's the current standard of care, versus giving them fresh units of blood, that's the question. And they want to see what impact that's going to have on their mortality and various other outcomes. And this trial is costing about $2 million, or about $80 per patient. And how are they doing it? The way they're doing it is they're embedding the trial into the electronic health record. Essentially, all the data they're collecting will be coming from the electronic health record. This is PCORI. I'm not going to speak about this very much because I know there's going to be more discussion about this, but this is very exciting. The PCORNet, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network, and this has the potential for being a real game changer. So this is a network of patient groups and clinical health systems that can leverage digital infrastructure to potentially conduct large-scale comparative studies and trials and be able to do these at very low cost by taking advantage of novel data sources that are there. So I'm going to end by saying that I think in some sense this is a very exciting time, and we are living in a world in which clinical trials are threatened. They may cease to exist, but they may also be reinvented. And this is an effort that's going on at NIH called the Collaboratory, the Healthcare Systems Collaboratory, which is a common fund project in which we are funding about 10 trials to look at different ways of getting these trials done, and particularly using electronic infrastructure such as electronic health records to conduct trials. Part of what they're doing is they're putting together what's called a living textbook on rethinking clinical trials. I would urge you to take a look at this. This is from Duke, and this is free. This is available. And the idea is that not only are we going through the experience of conducting clinical trials using novel sources of data, but we're also trying to learn from this and take our experience and put it into some kind of a systematic learning tool that is then available to everybody. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.